When 68-year-old Marcus Reynolds settled into his weathered ranch near Esperanza Valley, Arizona, he believed his days of precision and patience were behind him. For 3 decades, he had trained America's deadliest snipers, molding ordinary soldiers into extraordinary marksmen. Now, he wanted nothing more than to tend his horses and share quiet sunsets with his wife Eleanor. But when the ruthless Salazar cartel mistook his solitary lifestyle for vulnerability, they discovered too late that they had challenged the man who had trained the very shadows that kept America safe. What began as simple intimidation against an elderly rancher became the catalyst for one of the most precise and methodical takedowns in border security history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted long shadows across the desert landscape as Marcus adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, scanning the horizon with the same measured precision he'd once used to train elite marksmen. The Arizona heat was building, but decades of patience in hostile environments had taught him to embrace discomfort. His calloused hands gripped the fence post he was mending, though his eyes never stopped their careful sweep of the terrain. 30 years of training, America's most elite snipers had ingrained habits that retirement couldn't erase. Every rock formation, every patch of brush, every subtle change in elevation. His mind automatically catalogued potential positions, angles, and sightlines. Not for combat now, but for the simple pleasure of watching his horses graze safely. In the morning light, the radio on his belt crackled. "Marcus!" Eleanor's voice carried a hint of concern that immediately caught his attention. "Rosa's here. Something's wrong." Marcus straightened, his movements deliberate and economical. Rosa Hernandez had managed his ranch operations for the past 6 years, and she wasn't one to worry without cause. He climbed into his weathered pickup, the vehicle kicking up dust as he made his way back to the main house. Eleanor and Rosa stood on the wraparound porch, their postures tense. Rosa's usual warm smile was replaced by tight-drawn lips and worried eyes. Her husband Diego worked as the local high school's groundskeeper, and their family had become an integral part of the ranch's operations. "Mr. Reynolds," Rosa began, as Marcus approached, "2 men came to our house last night. They asked questions about the ranch, about you." She pulled a business card from her pocket, holding it out with slightly trembling hands. Diego told them nothing, but they left this. Marcus took the card, studying it with the same attention to detail he'd once used to evaluate target conditions. Clean white cardstock, black embossed text, Southwest Property Development, LLC. "They carried themselves like military," Rosa continued, her voice low, "but wrong kind of military." Diego noticed their weapons, not hidden, but not obvious either. Professional. She glanced at Eleanor. "They're the same ones who visited the Whitaker place before." The sentence hung unfinished. Everyone knew about the Whitaker ranch. 3 months ago, James Whitaker had sold his property for a fraction of its worth and moved his family to Colorado. The official story cited health concerns, but the bruises on his teenage son's face had told a different story. Eleanor touched Rosa's arm gently. "Come inside, dear. I'll make some coffee." As they turned toward the door, Eleanor's eyes met Marcus's. They'd been married long enough that words weren't necessary. She saw the subtle shift in his posture, the slightly narrowed eyes that meant his tactical mind was already at work. Marcus pulled out his phone, dialing a number he'd hoped he wouldn't need to use. Sheriff Sarah Martinez answered on the third ring. "Bit early for trouble, Marcus." "Had some visitors at the Hernandez place last night. Southwest Property Development, LLC. A heavy pause filled the line. "Fourth case this month. They're working their way up the valley systematically." The sheriff's voice dropped lower. "Listen, Marcus, got a briefing from the DEA yesterday. Confirmed what we suspected. It's the Salazar cartel. They're establishing new routes, using ranches as way stations." Marcus processed this information, his mind already calculating angles and approaches, just as he'd taught countless snipers to do. They're not just buying property, are they? No, each ranch they acquire becomes part of their infrastructure. Those who don't sell... She let the implication hang in the air. "We're stretched thin, Marcus. Real thin." As if to punctuate her words, a dark SUV with tinted windows crawled past his front gate, moving with the deliberate slowness of surveillance. Marcus watched it in his truck's side mirror, noting every detail with professional precision. Inside, Eleanor was pouring coffee, the familiar scent filling the kitchen. She'd been his partner through decades of military service, understanding the weight of unspoken words. How bad. Could get complicated. Marcus accepted the coffee but remained standing. "Rosa, I want you and Diego to stay in the guest house for a few days, just until I sort something out." Rosa started to protest, but Eleanor interjected softly. "Please, we'd feel better knowing you're close." Later that afternoon, Marcus stood in his study, looking at the wall where his commendations hung. Photographs of graduating sniper classes, each soldier's eyes carrying the same focused intensity he'd helped instill. But his attention was on the satellite imagery spread across his desk, marking key positions, fields of fire, and potential blind spots. Old habits. A truck engine rumbled outside. Deputy Jack Cooper, young and earnest, was walking up to the house. "Mr. Reynolds, we've got reports of more SUVs matching the description Rosa gave. They're checking properties all along the valley." Marcus nodded, his mind already gaming out scenarios. "They're establishing patterns, looking for routines, security measures, reaction times." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "You seem pretty familiar with their methods." "Let's just say this isn't my first experience with organized threats." Marcus turned back to his maps. "Tell Sarah, I'm seeing a pattern. They're not just looking for property, they're looking for specific features. High ground, clear lines of sight to the highway, multiple access points." "Like your ranch?" "Exactly like my ranch." Marcus traced a line along the property's western ridge. "They'll make an offer first, try to keep things looking legitimate. When that fails..." He'd seen it before, in different contexts, but with the same underlying principles. Jack looked nervous. "We've got extra patrols, but with our manpower..." "I understand." Marcus walked the young deputy out. As Jack's cruiser disappeared down the dusty road, Marcus noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across his east pasture. They hadn't been there that morning. Eleanor found him examining the tracks half an hour later. "You're not going to sell, are you? This land belonged to your father." "Some things are worth defending," Marcus replied, his eyes on the setting sun where dust clouds marked another vehicle moving along his fence line. "Get Rosa and Diego settled in the guest house. I need to make some calls." That evening, as darkness settled over the ranch, Marcus sat at his radio, contacting old friends. Not for help. He'd never risk bringing them into this, but for information. The Salazar cartel was expanding aggressively, their operations sophisticated and their methods brutal. Eleanor brought him dinner, setting it beside the radio without comment. She knew this version of her husband, the quiet, focused man who saw solutions in angles and trajectories. "Just promise me one thing," she said from the doorway. "Promise me you won't face this alone." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus looked up at his wife of 42 years. "I won't." He meant it, but not perhaps in the way she hoped. He'd already started forming a plan, one that would protect not just his ranch, but the entire community. The cartel had chosen this valley thinking they'd found easy targets. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. A coyote howled in the distance, and Marcus's radio crackled with the voice of an old student, now an instructor at Fort Benning. "You're not thinking about taking a stand, are you, Chief? Not thinking, planning." Marcus's voice was steady, measured. "They're threatening my home, my people. Like old times then." The voice held a note of understanding. "Watch yourself, Marcus. These cartels, they're not like our old adversaries." "Same principles apply," Marcus replied. "Patience, precision, position. The fundamentals he'd taught to hundreds of elite marksmen. They're used to fighting with fear and intimidation. Let's see how they handle someone who knows how to wait." Tomorrow he would begin preparations, not just security measures, but a comprehensive strategy. The cartel had chosen this valley carefully, but they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed an old rancher would be an easy target. They were about to learn just how expensive that assumption would be, from a man who had spent his life teaching others the art of patience, precision, and the perfect shot. Marcus rose before dawn, his old habits serving him well. The ranch was quiet except for the soft whicker of horses in their stalls. He checked his phone. 4 missed calls from Sheriff Martinez. The cartel had made another move overnight. Eleanor was already in the kitchen, police scanner humming quietly on the counter. She'd been a military wife long enough to read situations. They hit the Anderson place last night. No one hurt, but their stables were vandalized. Warning shot. Marcus studied his ranch maps, adding another marker. The pattern was becoming clearer. Systematic intimidation moving from east to west, following the valley's natural contours. He watched through the window as a black Escalade slowed near his gate, 2 men inside, studying the property. Not cartel soldiers. These were the business face of the operation, the ones who made the first approach look legitimate. Rosa burst in through the back door, face flushed. "They're at the North Ridge. 3 men taking photographs." "Stay here," Marcus told both women. He retrieved his rifle, legally owned, properly registered, and headed out. Not to confront, but to be seen, to let them know this ranch had teeth. The men at the ridge spotted him coming. One reached for something at his waist, but the leader stopped him with a gesture. Smart. They weren't ready for confrontation. Not yet. "Private property," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades of instruction. "Just surveying," the leader replied smoothly. "Southwest. Property development. Perhaps you received our card." Marcus stopped 30 yards away, rifle held casually but ready. "Not interested in selling." "You haven't heard our offer, Mr. Reynolds." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The market's very favorable right now." "Market's always Favorable for someone? Marcus shifted slightly, letting the sun catch his rifle scope. But this land isn't for sale. Not today, not tomorrow. The leader's smile tightened. Things change, Mr. Reynolds. Property values, safety conditions. They can be unpredictable out here. He handed a thick envelope to one of his men who walked forward and wedged it into the fence wire. Consider it carefully. We'll be in touch. Marcus watched them leave, memorizing faces, gaits, the way they moved, details that told stories to trained eyes. Once they were gone, he retrieved the envelope. Inside was an offer for 4 times the ranch's market value, along with photos. Recent ones. Eleanor at the grocery store, Rosa picking up her children from school. Back inside, Dr. Thomas Chen was waiting with Eleanor. The old trauma surgeon had been Marcus's friend since Afghanistan, where they'd first met in less peaceful circumstances. "Thought I'd stop by," Thomas said casually, but his eyes were sharp. "Heard about the Anderson place." Marcus spread the photos on the kitchen table. Eleanor's hand went to her mouth, but she didn't speak. "They're escalating faster than expected," Thomas observed quietly. "Town meeting tonight. Might want to be there." The meeting at Esperanza Valley's community center was packed, fear having brought out every rancher and farmer in the region. Sheriff Martinez stood at the front, trying to maintain order as voices rose in anger and panic. "We've increased patrols," she was saying, "but our resources are limited. The FBI has been notified." "The FBI?" someone shouted. "By the time they act, we'll all be burned out." Marcus sat quietly in the back, watching, listening. Deputy Cooper spotted him and made his way over. "Got something?" he whispered, sliding into the seat next to Marcus. "That business card? Traced it to a shell company in Nogales. Guess who owns the building? Carlos Salazar's brother-in-law." Marcus nodded. The pieces were fitting together. They're not just buying properties, they're creating a corridor. For what? Everything: drugs, weapons, people. Marcus's voice was low. Each ranch they acquire becomes a safe house, a storage facility, a waypoint. They're building infrastructure piece by piece. The meeting devolved into arguments about forming citizen patrols. Marcus slipped out early, his mind already working on counter-moves. At home, he found Eleanor in his study, standing before a hidden gun safe he'd kept concealed behind his certificates. "I thought we were done with this," she said softly, looking at the specialized equipment inside, gear that no ordinary rancher would own. "It's just insurance." Marcus closed the safe gently. "Precautions, like the surveillance equipment, I've been installing." Eleanor turned to face him. "I know what this is, Marcus. I've seen it before. You're preparing for war." "No." Marcus took her hands. "I'm preventing one. But I need you to trust me." A car's headlights swept across the window. Rosa's voice came urgently over the radio. "Mr. Reynolds, 2 trucks just pulled up to Diego's auto shop in town. The men, they're asking about ranch access roads." Marcus squeezed Eleanor's hands, once before letting go. "Get Sarah on the phone. Tell her to drive by Diego's place, slow and visible. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Marcus," Eleanor's voice stopped him at the door, "whatever you're planning, remember you're not alone." He nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The cartel was moving faster than expected, pushing harder. They needed to be stopped before things got worse, but it had to be done right, legal, by the book. But if they forced his hand... Well, Marcus hadn't spent 30 years training elite marksmen without learning a few things about precision strikes. The cartel thought they were dealing with an old rancher. Soon they'd learn just how expensive that mistake would be. As he drove toward town, his phone lit up with a text from Thomas. "Like the old days?" Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. Not quite like the old days. This time he was fighting for his home, his community, and this time he had everything to lose, which meant he had to be even more precise, more patient, more perfect in his execution. The trucks were gone by the time Marcus reached Diego's shop, but they'd left their message. Broken windows, slashed tires on customer vehicles. Sheriff Martinez was already there, taking photos for evidence. "They're getting bolder," she said as Marcus pulled up. "State police are talking about sending support." "Won't matter," Marcus replied, examining a shell casing left behind. "By the time support arrives, the damage will be done. They're working to a timeline." "How can you be so sure?" Marcus picked up the casing. "Because that's how I do. Hit hard, hit fast, overwhelm resistance before proper defenses can be organized." He pocketed the casing. "But they made a mistake." "Yeah? What's that?" Marcus looked at the broken glass, the slashed tires, the message of intimidation, written in casual destruction. "They showed their hand too early. Now we know what we're dealing with." He smiled slightly. "And knowledge, properly applied with patience and precision, is better than any weapon." Back at the ranch, Marcus spent the night mapping patterns, marking incidents, analyzing the cartel's methodology. They were professional, he'd give them that. But professionals could be predicted, counted, beaten, especially by someone who'd spent his life teaching others how to wait for the perfect moment. As dawn broke over Esperanza Valley, Marcus Reynolds was ready to show the Salazar cartel exactly why some old ranchers shouldn't be underestimated. The game was just beginning, and he intended to change the rules, not with brute force, but with the same precise, patient methodology he'd spent his life teaching to America's elite. Marksmen, patience, precision, position. The fundamentals that had made him a legend in sniper training would now protect his home. And like every perfect shot, timing would be everything. Diego's voice crackled over the radio at midnight. "Mr. Reynolds, they're back. 8 men this time. Professional gear." Marcus was already moving, his boots silent on the wooden floor. Eleanor watched from their bedroom door as he pulled out a specialized case from under the bed, equipment he'd hoped would stay unused. "Called Sarah," Eleanor said quietly. "She's handling a situation at the Peterson farm." "Too convenient." Marcus checked his equipment. "They're coordinating now." He kissed Eleanor quickly. "Call Thomas. Tell him to be ready, just in case." The streets of Esperanza Valley were empty as Marcus's truck rolled toward Diego's shop. No police cars in sight, no witnesses. Perfect conditions for intimidation. He parked 2 blocks away, moving on foot through shadows he'd mapped days ago. The men at Diego's shop were professionals, positioned at corners, watching approaches. But they were watching for threats they understood, not for a man who'd spent decades teaching others how to become invisible. Marcus caught fragments of their conversation, Spanish, but not Mexican Spanish, Colombian accents, the Salazar. Cartel was bringing in outside talent. "No sign of the old man," one said, lighting a cigarette. "Maybe he got smart." "Salazar wants this corridor cleared," another replied. "One way or another." Marcus touched his radio twice, a signal to Eleanor. 30 seconds later, sirens wailed in the distance. The men tensed, then quickly dispersed into waiting vehicles. Marcus memorized plates, faces, details that didn't match their cover story. Diego emerged from hiding as Marcus approached the shop. "They didn't find it," he whispered, pulling up a floorboard to reveal a small camera. "All the footage, just like you asked." "Good man." Marcus helped him replace the board. "Your family safe at the ranch?" "With Miss Eleanor. Rosa's with them." Diego's hands shook slightly. "It's really happening, isn't it? Just like you said." Marcus nodded. The cartel was following a playbook he knew too well. He'd helped write parts of it years ago, teaching snipers how to establish dominance over an area. Time to show them how those lessons could work in reverse. Sheriff Martinez arrived 10 minutes later, alone. Her face was tight with anger. "Peterson's place was a false alarm. Someone called it in, then called back to cancel after I was all ready." "There." She looked at Marcus. "You knew." "Suspected. They're probing, testing response times, checking procedures." Marcus shared what he'd overheard. "They're getting ready to move. 2 weeks, maybe less." "How can you be sure?" "Because it's what I do. Clear the corridor before the main operation begins. Remove potential witnesses. Establish infrastructure." Marcus's voice was grim. "We need to move faster." Back at the ranch, Eleanor had coffee waiting. Dr. Chen sat at the kitchen table, his medical bag beside him. Old habits died hard. "Diego's family settled in the West Guest House," Eleanor reported. "Rosa's got the children distracted with board games, and this came while you were gone." She handed Marcus a thick envelope. Inside was another offer, higher this time, along with more photos. Marcus's truck in town, Diego's shop, the school Rosa's children attended. "They're escalating," Thomas observed, studying the photos, getting impatient. "Not impatient. Aggressive. There's a difference." Marcus spread the photos on the table. "Sarah, look at this one. The angle. The timing. This wasn't taken by someone watching the school." Sheriff Martinez examined the photo, her expression darkening. "This was taken from inside. Someone in the school is working with them. They've had months to place people, build networks." Marcus's mind raced through implications, connections. "We need to assume they have eyes everywhere." "So what's the play?" Thomas asked quietly. Before Marcus could answer, headlights swept across the kitchen window, multiple vehicles approaching fast. "Eleanor," Marcus said calmly, "get everyone into the basement. Sarah, your choice. Stay or go, but if you stay, you're all in." Sheriff Martinez drew her service weapon. Already all in. The vehicles stopped outside, 4 SUVs deliberately positioned to cast shadows across the front of the house. Car doors opened and closed. "Mr. Reynolds," a cultured voice called out. "My name is Adrian Santos. I believe we should talk." Marcus moved to the window, staying in shadow. 10 men, professionally spaced. Santos stood in front, unarmed, wearing an expensive suit. Behind him his men carried automatic weapons with practiced ease. "Your property has become very important to our organization," Santos continued. "We're prepared to be generous, very generous." Marcus clicked his radio once. In the guest house, Diego would be activating the cameras Marcus had installed days ago, recording everything. "The price goes down every day you delay," Santos called out. "And accidents. Accidents can happen to anyone, even children." Marcus's hand tightened on his weapon, but his voice remained steady. "You've made a serious mistake, Mr. Santos." "Oh? And what mistake is that?" "You assumed because I was old, I was harmless. Because I was alone, I was vulnerable." Marcus smiled grimly in the darkness. You should have checked my background more carefully. Santos laughed. Your background? You were a sniper instructor, yes? Decades ago. Now you're just an old man with a ranch he can't protect. Maybe, Marcus agreed, or maybe I'm the man who wrote the manual on counter-surveillance techniques. The one they still teach at Fort Benning. He paused. The manual your spotters are using badly. The silence that followed was heavy with sudden uncertainty. You have one chance, Marcus continued. Leave my ranch, leave this valley. Otherwise, I'll show you exactly why that manual works so well. Santos's voice hardened. You're threatening me. No, I'm giving you good advice, free of charge. The SUVs left 10 minutes later. Marcus watched them go, then turned to Sarah. They'll be back, with more men. What's the play? She asked. Marcus pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. Time to change the game. Call Chief Thompson at the State Police. Tell him to expect some visitors. Old? Students who owe me a favor. Eleanor emerged from the basement, her face set with familiar determination. I'll make up the guest rooms. As dawn broke over Esperanza Valley, Marcus Reynolds began preparing for a war he'd hoped to avoid. But this time, he wasn't fighting. In some distant desert, teaching others how to take the perfect shot. This time, he was fighting for his home, his community, his family. And this time, he would apply every lesson he'd ever taught about patience, precision, and the perfect moment. To strike, the cartel was about to learn that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the one that moves fastest, but the one that waits longest for the perfect shot. 3 black SUVs rolled into Esperanza Valley at dawn, but these weren't cartel vehicles. Jason Ramirez, Marcus's former star student from Fort Benning, stepped out of the lead vehicle. 15 years younger than Marcus, but already showing traces of silver in his dark hair, he carried himself with the unmistakable precision of an elite sniper. Like old times, Chief, Jason said as Marcus approached, though usually we weren't protecting Arizona ranches. Same principles, different terrain. Marcus gestured to the men emerging from the other vehicles. He recognized Cooper and Rodriguez. The others all wore the quiet confidence of men who'd mastered the art of patience. Best in the business now, Jason said. All private security, all legitimate, clean records, licensed, and all owing you their careers, Marcus finished. They gathered in Dr. Chen's clinic, neutral ground, less watched than the ranch. Sheriff Martinez arrived last, carrying a thick folder. It's worse than we thought, she said, spreading surveillance photos across the examination table. Found these in a locked file at the station. Money transfers, property deals, all tied to shell companies in Mexico City. The school superintendent is compromised. 3 deputies on cartel payroll. A commotion outside interrupted them. Dr. Chen rushed in, his usually calm demeanor shaken. Marcus, it's the Miller place. They hit it hard. 5 ranch hands injured. Precision shots, kneecaps, shoulders, professional work. Jason's team moved with practiced efficiency, securing the clinic's perimeter as Dr. Chen treated the wounded men. Their stories painted an ugly picture. 20 armed men, systematic destruction of equipment, clear messages about what would happen next. They're accelerating, Jason observed. This isn't their usual pattern. Because of us, Marcus replied. We've disrupted their timeline. Now they're adapting. His phone buzzed. Eleanor's emergency signal. Something was wrong at the ranch. The scene at Reynolds' ranch froze Marcus's blood. 3 unmarked cars blocked Rosa's vehicle in the driveway. her children still inside. "Please," Rosa begged the men surrounding her car. "They're just children." "Then you should think carefully about cooperation," one man replied smoothly. "Mr. Salazar is very interested in your employer's access to local water rights." Marcus assessed the situation from the tree line. 6 men, professionally positioned. These weren't local thugs. They were trained. But training worked both ways. Jason's voice whispered in his radio. "We've got the perimeter. Your call, Chief." Marcus touched his radio twice, a signal to Eleanor. Seconds later, the ranch's sprinkler system burst to life, disrupting sightlines. In the confusion, Marcus's team moved. The fight was brief, precise. No shots fired. They couldn't risk attention. When it was over, 6 cartel enforcers lay zip-tied in the grass. "State police are coming," Sheriff Martinez announced, joining them. "But not through official channels. I called my contact at the Rangers directly." Rosa hugged her children as Marcus secured the scene. The cartel's men had carried law enforcement IDs, fake but convincing. Another piece of the puzzle. Later, in Marcus's office, Jason laid out what they'd learned. They've got people everywhere, school administration, local government, even church leadership, all bought or threatened into cooperation. "Classic infiltration tactics," Marcus noted. "Control the community, not just the territory." Eleanor entered with coffee and news. Lisa from the feed store called, said men were asking about our weekly supply deliveries, truck schedules. "They're mapping everything," Jason said. "Supply, lines, routines, vulnerabilities. Let them." Marcus's voice was steel. "While they're mapping us, we're mapping them." He turned to Sheriff Martinez. "Sarah, those files you found, who has access to the evidence lockup at the station?" "Just me and—" Martinez's eyes widened. "Jack, Deputy Cooper." The pieces clicked. Jack's convenient absences, his access to patrol schedules, his recent cash purchases in town. "We've got our leak," Marcus said quietly. "Now we use it." A crash from outside brought them all to their feet. One of Jason's men rushed in. "Boss, you need to see this." A burning cross stood in the ranch's south pasture, an old intimidation tactic made new again. But Marcus noticed details others missed. The accelerant pattern, the timing. "They're not trying to scare us," he realized. "They're showing us they can hit us at will. This is a message for someone else." As if in response, Deputy Cooper's cruiser pulled up to the ranch house. The young deputy stepped out, his face ashen. "Marcus, we need to talk. Alone." Inside, Cooper laid out the reality. "They've got my sister. Said they'll kill her if I don't play along. I'm not the only one." Marcus's mind raced through implications, possibilities. The cartel wasn't just building a smuggling corridor. They were taking over the entire region, piece by careful piece. "We'll get her back," Marcus promised. "But I need everything you know. Every name, every connection." As Cooper talked, Marcus watched Jason's team securing the ranch. They were good, professional, thorough, but the cartel had numbers, resources, and deep local penetration. This wasn't just about protecting his ranch anymore. The entire community was under siege, and most didn't even realize it yet. "Eleanor," Marcus called softly, "get Thomas on the phone. Tell him we'll need that clinic ready. Things are about to get very precise." The sun set over Esperanza Valley, painting the sky blood red. In the growing darkness, Marcus Reynolds prepared for a war unlike any he'd fought before. The enemy was here, among them, wearing friendly faces and official uniforms. But Marcus hadn't spent 30 years teaching America's deadliest snipers without learning how to identify the perfect moment to take a shot. The cartel thought they were being clever, playing a subtle game of territory and intimidation. They were about to learn that some old instructors never forgot how to demonstrate the lessons they taught. And this time, Marcus wasn't just fighting for a mission or a medal. This time, he was fighting to protect everything he loved. The time for patience was ending. Soon would come the moment every sniper lived for, when all the careful preparation, all the precise positioning, all the patient waiting culminated in that one perfect shot that changed everything. And Marcus Reynolds had never missed. Deputy Cooper's hands trembled as he laid out his sister's photos on Marcus's kitchen table. Jennifer Cooper, 26, a kindergarten teacher in Phoenix, had vanished 2 days ago. The cartel's messages were simple: cooperate or she dies. "She's not in Phoenix anymore," Marcus said, studying the background details in the photos, the distinctive red soil, the particular species of desert sage. "They're keeping her near the border." Jason spread out satellite maps of the region. 4 possible locations match the terrain, all owned by shell companies linked to the Salazar cartel. Eleanor entered with coffee and her own intelligence. Sarah's contact at the bank confirmed it. The money for those properties came through a law firm in Tucson, same one that's been pressuring local ranchers to sell. Marcus had seen this pattern before in other conflicts he'd trained snipers for. The cartel was building a network that looked legitimate on paper, every transaction technically legal. But beneath the paperwork lay violence and precision intimidation. "We move tonight," Marcus decided. "Jason, your team ready?" "Like the old days, Chief," Jason grinned grimly, "though we usually had more backup. We have something better." Marcus turned to Diego, who stood quietly in the corner. "You worked construction in Nogales before the cartel took over. Tell them what." "You told me." Diego stepped forward, pointing to one of the locations. "This building, I helped renovate it last year. The basement has a tunnel system connected to 4 other properties. The cartel uses them to move contraband." Sheriff Martinez burst in, her face flushed with urgency. "Marcus, Jack's making his move. He's called in reports of gunfire at 5 different ranches. All my deputies are spread thin, responding." "Not a coincidence," Marcus noted. "They're clearing the board for something big." He checked his watch. "How long until state police can respond?" "At least 3 hours with the routes they're watching." Marcus nodded to Jason. "That's our window. Sarah, I need you to keep the channels clear. Jack, you're with me. They'll be watching for you to break routine." He turned to Eleanor. "You know what to do." Eleanor's expression was steel. "Thomas's clinic is ready. Rosa and the children are already there." As darkness fell, Marcus's team moved into position. Years of experience had taught him that the best plans were simple ones. The cartel would expect complexity, subterfuge. Instead, they'd get direct action from an unexpected direction. "Remember," Marcus's voice was quiet in the radio, "we're not just rescuing Jennifer. We're gathering evidence. Everything you see, everyone you encounter, documented." The first phase went smoothly. Deputy Cooper drove to his usual evening patrol route, playing his role. 2 cartel watchers followed him. What they didn't see was Diego using his knowledge of the town's maintenance tunnels to move Marcus's team into position. The cartel had spent months building their network of influence. They never considered that a simple ranch hand might know more about the area's infrastructure than they did. The attack when it came, was precise. Jason's team hit 3 cartel properties simultaneously, not the obvious ones, but the quiet buildings where they kept their records, their money, their leverage over the community. "Marcus," Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "Jack's figured it out. He's calling in SWAT." "Good." Marcus's smile was cold, "because in about 30 seconds, state police will have evidence of him accepting cartel money. Eleanor's sending it now." "Confirmed." Eleanor's voice came from her position at the ranch's communication hub. "Bank records, photos, everything Sarah found, it's all going to state and federal authorities." The rescue itself was almost anticlimactic. Jennifer Cooper was exactly where Diego's intelligence suggested, guarded by men who never expected a direct assault. Marcus's team had her out before the cartel realized they were under attack, but it wasn't a clean victory. Rodriguez, one of Jason's men, took a bullet in the arm, and the cartel's response was immediate and vicious. "Multiple vehicles heading toward town," Eleanor reported. "Armed men, at least 40. They're not trying to be subtle anymore." Marcus had expected this. The cartel's playbook was predictable. When subtlety failed, they turned to overwhelming force. But he'd seen it before, training snipers in dozens of conflicts across the world. Power like that had a weakness. It was inflexible, obvious, easy to turn against itself. "Sarah," he commanded, "hit the sirens. All of them." The police station's emergency sirens wailed to life, sending the town into lockdown protocols they'd practiced since childhood. Streets emptied, doors locked, and the cartel's convoy found themselves alone on suddenly hostile ground. "They're splitting up," Jason reported. 4 groups trying to maintain control of their key positions. "Let them." Marcus's voice was steady. From her position at the ranch, Eleanor pressed a button. Across Esperanza Valley, cameras activated. Not just the ones Marcus had planted, but dozens more, equipment installed by concerned citizens over the past week, all feeding footage to secure servers far beyond the cartel's reach. "Every move they make, every man they show us," Marcus said quietly, "it's all evidence now." The night erupted into chaos as the cartel tried to reassert control. But they were fighting blind, reactive instead of proactive. Their carefully built network of influence meant nothing against an enemy who'd spent decades learning how to dismantle exactly this kind of operation. Dawn found Marcus's team regrouping at Dr. Chen's clinic. Jennifer Cooper was safe, traumatized, but alive. Rodriguez would recover, and more importantly, they had what they needed. Proof of the cartel's operations, their networks, their collaborators. "State police have Jack," Sarah reported. "He's talking, trying to make a deal. The cartel's local support network is falling apart." But Marcus knew better than to celebrate. He'd seen the hate in Adrian Santos's eyes when the cartel lieutenant realized how thoroughly he'd been outplayed. Men like that didn't retreat, they escalated. "They'll hit us hard now," he warned. "Everything we've seen so far was just the beginning." Eleanor brought coffee and fresh intelligence. "Our friends in Tucson say Salazar himself is involved now. This isn't just about a smuggling corridor anymore. It's personal." Marcus nodded grimly. The cartel would come with everything they had, but that's what he'd been counting on. Sometimes, to win a war, you had to let the enemy choose the battlefield. "Get some rest," he told his team. "Tomorrow we show them what happens when they bring their war to our home." As the sun rose over Esperanza Valley, Marcus Reynolds prepared for the biggest fight of his life. Not for country or duty this time, but for community and family. The cartel thought they were escalating the conflict. They didn't realize they were walking into a trap 30 years in the making. Every shot he'd ever taught, every lesson he'd ever given about patience and precision was about to be demonstrated on a scale the cartel never expected. They were about to learn why some old instructors were best left to their peaceful retirement, because when forced back into action, they remembered every single lesson they'd ever taught. Miguel Salazar's arrival in Esperanza Valley wasn't subtle. A convoy of armored vehicles and tactical SUVs rolled through town in broad daylight, a deliberate show of force. Behind tinted windows, the cartel leader watched the empty streets with calculated interest. Marcus observed from Dr. Chen's clinic rooftop, his trained eye counting vehicles and noting armaments. 20 vehicles, at least 60 men. He lowered his binoculars. Professional equipment, military grade. These aren't street soldiers. Cartel's elite unit, Jason confirmed through the radio. I recognize some of them. Ex-special forces, probably trained at the same facilities we used. The convoy split into 4 groups, each taking strategic positions around the valley. Classic encirclement tactics, Marcus noted. They're establishing a perimeter. They're setting up checkpoints, Sarah reported. Cutting off all access. Roads except the main highway. Marcus had expected this. The cartel was done with subtle manipulation. Now they would demonstrate their power, show the community what happened to those who resisted. Eleanor's voice came over the radio. Marcus, Salazar just called the house. Says he wants to meet. Just talk. No weapons. Sure he does. Marcus's voice was dry. Right after he positioned shooters on every high ground overlooking the ranch. Nice! The cartel's snipers were good, but Marcus had spent decades teaching men like them. He'd spotted their positions within minutes of their arrival. More importantly, he'd already prepared countermeasures they'd never expect. What's the play? Chief, Jason asked. Spring the trap. Marcus descended from the roof. But first we get the civilians out. The evacuation plan had been ready for days. Dr. Chen's patients suddenly needed transfer to Tucson. The school announced an emergency field trip. Ranching. Families found urgent reasons to visit relatives. By noon, most of the vulnerable population was gone. Those who remained were either part of Marcus's network or had chosen to stand and fight. Salazar's call came again at sunset. This time Marcus answered. Mr. Reynolds, the cartel leader's voice was cultured, almost pleasant. You've caused me considerable inconvenience. That was the idea. I understand a man protects his home, but surely you see the futility of resistance. I have resources you can't imagine. Maybe. Marcus watched the sun setting behind the hills where Salazar's men waited. But I have something better. Oh, and what's that? 30 years of teaching men like yours, men who think fancy equipment and superior numbers equal victory. Marcus's voice hardened. Men who never learned that the deadliest shot isn't always the most obvious one. The attack came at midnight. Multiple vehicles hit the ranch simultaneously, expecting to find Marcus's team scrambling to defend it. Instead, they found emptiness. Sir, one of Salazar's men reported, the buildings are deserted. No sign of Reynolds or his people. Because Marcus wasn't defending the ranch, he was executing a strategy decades in the making. The first explosion took out the cartel's northern checkpoint. The second eliminated their communication center. Not bombs, fuel tanks and electrical. Failures, all perfectly ordinary accidents. "What the hell?" Salazar demanded as reports flooded in. "Find Reynolds." But Marcus was everywhere and nowhere. His team, augmented by local ranchers who knew every inch of the valley, struck and vanished. Years of military experience combined with intimate local knowledge. "South team compromised," a cartel operator reported. "They're picking us apart." Eleanor coordinated from a hidden command center, using the town's infrastructure against the invaders. Traffic lights, power grids, water systems, all became weapons in practiced hands. "State police are 30 minutes out." Sarah's voice crackled over secure channels. "Real ones this time. I vetted them personally." But the cartel had one card left to play. A massive explosion rocked the feed store, their secondary location exposed. "They found the families," Jason reported tensely. Marcus's blood ran cold. The feed store evacuation had been a cover. The real safe house was elsewhere, but the store still held supplies and evidence. "Everyone's safe," Eleanor confirmed, "but they're sending a message. Next time it could be the school, the church." "No," Marcus's voice was steel. "There won't be a next time." He switched channels. "All units, implement Sierra Protocol." Across the valley, lights began going out, not just buildings, but entire sections of the power grid. Communication channels filled with static, GPS signals scrambled. In the darkness, Marcus's people owned the night. "They're hitting us from everywhere," a cartel soldier screamed over the radio. Marcus's voice was calm as he contacted Salazar directly. "Still think this is about money and guns?" The cartel leader's response was predictable. He ordered his men to burn everything. But in the darkness, his soldiers were shooting at shadows, wasting ammunition on empty buildings. Dawn revealed the true cost of the night's battle. 5. Of Salazar's vehicles destroyed, 15 men captured, and most importantly, their carefully constructed aura of invincibility shattered. "They'll regroup," Jason warned as they surveyed the damage. "Come back stronger." "Count on it." Marcus studied the horizon where dust clouds marked the cartel's retreat. But now they know what they're really fighting, and doubt is a weapon that never runs out of ammunition. Eleanor joined them, her face tight with concern. "Sarah says they're calling in reinforcements, professional mercenaries." "Good." Marcus's smile was grim. "Because now we know their playbook, and they still haven't figured out ours." The sun rose over Esperanza Valley, revealing a changed landscape. The cartel had expected to crush resistance with overwhelming force. Instead, they'd been bloodied by ghosts. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Salazar wouldn't retreat. Men like him couldn't afford to show weakness. The next attack would be bigger, more brutal, and that's exactly what Marcus was counting on. Sometimes the best trap was letting your enemy think they had you cornered. The real war was just beginning, and every lesson Marcus had ever taught about patience, precision, and the perfect moment was about to be demonstrated on a scale the cartel never expected. They thought they were bringing war to a peaceful valley. They were about to learn they'd walked into a master class taught by the man who'd trained America's deadliest snipers, and this time the lesson would be final. The mercenaries arrived, in civilian clothes, filtering into Esperanza Valley in ones and twos. To ordinary observers, they might have passed for tourists or business travelers, but Marcus recognized their bearing, their careful positioning, the way they systematically mapped their surroundings. Israeli private military contractors, Jason reported, watching through his scope as another group checked into the local motel. Ex-Mossad, mostly. Salazar's not playing around anymore. Marcus studied their movements from his hidden observation post. These weren't cartel thugs. They were professionals who'd fought in conflicts across the Middle East and Africa, men who understood patience, planning, and precision. "I count 20 so far," Sarah added through the radio. "All carrying diplomatic pouches, probably how they got their equipment across the border." Eleanor's voice crackled over the secure channel. "Marcus, our friends at the bank say Salazar just moved 10 million through accounts in Tel Aviv and Dubai. He's hiring the best." "Good," Marcus noted. "How is that good?" Jason lowered his binoculars. "Because professionals think like professionals." Marcus smiled slightly. "They'll look for the threats they understand." The mercenaries spent 3 days conducting reconnaissance, mapping the area, establishing patterns. They were thorough, methodical, everything Marcus expected them to be. What they didn't know was that every move they made was being watched, not just by Marcus's team, but by an entire community that had learned to resist. Dr. Chen's newly arrived patients were actually monitoring foot traffic. Diego's network of maintenance workers tracked vehicles and equipment. Even the local kids playing in the streets were counting men and reporting unusual faces. "They're good," Eleanor observed on the 4th day, watching camera feeds from their new command center in an abandoned warehouse. "But they're fighting the last war." Marcus nodded. The mercenaries were looking for military responses, tactical positions, traditional defensive setups. They weren't prepared for a whole community working as one. The first test came when they tried to establish a surveillance post overlooking the ranch. Within hours, a dozen small problems arose. Roadwork blocked access routes, power outages, disabled their equipment. Local dogs barked incessantly at their hidden positions. "Getting frustrated," Sarah reported. "Just heard their commander on an encrypted channel. Says the local interference is too organized to be accidental." "He's right," Marcus replied, but knowing that doesn't help him. The mercenaries adapted, switching to mobile operations, changing patterns, professional solutions to professional problems. But Marcus had spent his career teaching men like these, and he knew their greatest weakness. They thought like soldiers. When they set up a sophisticated electronic surveillance network, Marcus's team didn't attack it. Instead, local teenagers rode dirt bikes nearby, kicking up dust that clogged expensive equipment. When they established sniper positions, elderly couples just happened to set up bird-watching posts in the same areas. "This is psychological warfare," Jason realized, watching another mercenary team abandon a position due to an accidental fertilizer spill upwind. Death by 1,000 cuts. But the real stroke came from an unexpected quarter. Rosa's cousin Manuel reported Cartel soldiers growing increasingly unhappy. The mercenaries were commanding higher pay while looking down on their local counterparts. "Salazar's men are talking," Rosa reported. "They don't like being sidelined in their own territory." Marcus had seen it before. Professional soldiers versus local fighters, each dismissing the other's expertise. The resulting friction was as predictable as it was useful. The breakthrough came when Sarah intercepted a secured transmission. The mercenary commander was requesting additional funds, claiming local cartel support was unreliable and potentially Compromised. Salazar's response was immediate and harsh. "I'm paying you to solve problems, not make excuses." The argument that followed revealed exactly what Marcus had been waiting for: details of the cartel's complete operation, spoken in anger over supposedly secure channels. "Sending it now," Eleanor reported. "Federal task force confirms receipt. They're moving within the hour." But victory had its price. One of the mercenary teams, frustrated by constant failures, decided to send a message. They attacked what they thought was a vulnerable target, Dr. Chen's new clinic. The ensuing firefight was brief but intense. Marcus's team repelled the attack, but not before 3 local defenders were wounded. The mercenaries lost 5 men. Professional soldiers who'd survived wars across 3 continents, taken down by ranch hands fighting for their community. "They'll escalate now," Jason warned as they treated the wounded. "Hit us with everything they have." "No," Marcus corrected, watching drone footage of the mercenary teams regrouping. "First, they'll step back, analyze, look for the pattern. That's what professionals do." He was right. The mercenaries withdrew to their temporary headquarters at the motel, consolidating forces and reviewing tactics. To them, this was a military problem, requiring a military solution. They never saw Rosa's niece cleaning their rooms, photographing documents. Never noticed Eleanor's network of observers counting ammunition and supplies. Never suspected that their secure communications were being monitored by equipment Marcus had borrowed from old friends in intelligence services. "Federal task force in position," Sarah reported at sunset. "State police have sealed off escape routes. They're ready." Marcus studied the latest surveillance photos. The mercenaries were preparing for a major operation, gathering intelligence and planning contingencies, everything by the book. But they'd forgotten the first rule of counterinsurgency. The battlefield isn't just terrain and tactics. It's people, relationships, the invisible web of community that no amount of professional training can fully map. "Tell our people to be ready," Marcus instructed Eleanor. "Tomorrow, we show them the difference between fighting an enemy and fighting a community." As night fell over Esperanza Valley, the mercenaries made their final preparations. They had the training, the equipment, and the experience of a dozen wars. What they didn't know was that they'd already lost, not to superior tactics or firepower, but to a community united against them. Sometimes the strongest defense isn't a wall or a weapon. Sometimes it's 1,000 pairs of eyes watching and waiting, guided by a man who'd spent his life teaching others the art of patience. And tomorrow, Marcus Reynolds would give his final lesson, not to eager students at Fort Benning, but to professional killers who were about to learn why he'd been the master instructor of America's deadliest snipers. They thought they were launching an operation. Instead, they were walking into a class they'd never forget, taught by a professor who graded in blood. The mercenaries struck at dawn, just as Marcus predicted. 8 teams hitting multiple targets simultaneously, expecting to overwhelm any resistance with precise, coordinated violence. Their night vision equipment cut through the pre-dawn darkness as they approached their objectives. "Contact west." Jason's voice was calm over the radio. 3 teams moving on the clinic. South team advancing on the ranch, Sarah added. Fast and professional. Marcus watched from his command position, noting their formations, their tactics, everything textbook perfect, which was exactly their weakness. They were fighting the way they'd been trained, the way they'd fought in other wars. But this wasn't other wars. The first team hit an empty clinic, finding only old medical supplies and prepared documents, exactly what Marcus wanted them to see. The second team encountered something very different. "Surprise package delivered," Eleanor reported, as remote triggers activated industrial fertilizer spreaders. Thick clouds of ammonia dust filled the air, rendering expensive night vision equipment worse than useless. Cursing in Hebrew filled the radio channels as the mercenaries fought through sudden blindness. They switched to thermal imaging, but Marcus had planned for that too. "Now!" he commanded. Across the valley, railroad emergency flares ignited, their intense heat creating dozens of false signatures on thermal scanners. Professional soldiers suddenly couldn't trust their expensive equipment. But the mercenaries were good. They adjusted quickly, switching to basic infantry tactics. That's when they discovered the real trap. "They're in the kill box," Jason reported, "moving exactly where we want them." The mercenaries had mapped every building, every line of sight, planning their assault meticulously. But they'd missed the obvious, the decades of ranching experience that had shaped this land. Irrigation ditches became trenches. Cattle paths turned into channeled approaches. Every fence line and gate had been positioned over years to control movement. The valley itself was one giant funnel, and the mercenaries were walking right into it. "Federal task force in position." Sarah's voice was tight with tension. "Waiting for your signal." But Marcus waited, watching the mercenaries push deeper into his prepared ground. Years of teaching snipers had taught him timing was everything. The shooting started when the mercenaries reached the old barn. Their thermal scans showed it empty, but when they breached, they found themselves facing their own cartel employers. "What the hell are you doing here?" The mercenary commander's voice crackled over intercepted channels. "This position was supposed to be clear." "These are our operations," Salazar's lieutenant shot back. "We don't take orders from hired guns." The argument escalated exactly as Marcus had planned. He'd spent days feeding both groups different intelligence, different orders, knowing their professional pride would do the rest. "Eleanor," he called quietly, "show them what they've been missing." Across the valley, hidden cameras activated, broadcasting on frequencies both groups monitored. Suddenly, they could see their own forces, scattered, divided, caught in carefully prepared crossfires. "They're breaking," Jason reported. "Mercenaries falling back to secondary positions." But those positions were already compromised. Diego's network of local workers had spent days moving equipment, changing landscapes, turning familiar terrain into a maze. "Now," Marcus ordered. The federal task force moved with precision, born of months of preparation. Not just law enforcement, but military units that owed Marcus favors, intelligence agencies that remembered his service. The mercenaries found their escape routes blocked, their fallback positions exposed. Professional soldiers suddenly faced the nightmare scenario, fighting an enemy that knew their playbook better than they did. "Clinic team pinned down," Sarah reported. "They're calling for support." But support wasn't coming. The cartel forces, angry at being sidelined by foreign mercenaries, were holding back. Old rivalries and wounded pride trumped tactical necessity. "Marcus!" Dr. Chen's voice came over the radio, calm despite the chaos. "They're breaking into smaller groups. 5 mercenaries just surrendered at my position." "Keep them talking," Marcus instructed. "Every detail helps." The mercenary commander tried to regain control, ordering his teams to consolidate. But consolidation meant predictability, and Marcus had spent a lifetime learning how to exploit that. All units. Broadcast on their frequencies, this is Marcus Reynolds, former chief instructor of the U.S. Army Sniper School. You've walked into a trap 30 years in the making. Look around you. Every position you planned to use, every route you mapped, we've been preparing them for weeks. Silence filled the channels. These were professional soldiers. They understood the implications. You have two choices, Marcus continued. Surrender to the federal task force surrounding you, or try to shoot your way out. But ask yourselves, if we've planned this far ahead, what else are we ready for? The response came from an unexpected quarter. The mercenary commander's voice, tight with professional respect. Well played, Chief. I see why they still teach your methods at Benning. One by one, mercenary teams began surrendering, not to local law enforcement or even federal agents, but to Marcus's people, the ranchers and townspeople they'd dismissed as irrelevant. But the cartel forces weren't finished. Salazar's lieutenant, enraged by the mercenaries' surrender, ordered an all-out assault on the ranch. Here they come, Jason warned. At least 40 men, no formation, just anger. Marcus smiled grimly. And that's their last mistake. The cartel's attack fell apart under concentrated fire from prepared positions. Not just Marcus's team, but local ranchers who'd spent their lives shooting from horseback, law enforcement officers fighting for their community, federal agents who'd waited months for this moment. As the sun rose over Esperanza Valley, the scale of Marcus's victory became clear. 20 mercenaries captured, dozens of cartel soldiers dead or surrendered, and most importantly, evidence, computer records, phone data, everything needed to dismantle Salazar's entire operation. Federal task force moving in to secure the area, Sarah reported. State police have sealed the highways. No one's getting out. But Marcus knew better than to celebrate. Miguel Salazar was still out there, and men like him didn't accept defeat easily. Eleanor, he called, get me everything we have on Salazar's personal security. He'll have an escape plan. Already on it, she replied. Manuel just sent word. There's movement at Salazar's compound in Nogales. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. Marcus had broken the cartel's military arm, but Salazar's money and influence remained dangerous weapons. All units maintain positions, he ordered. This isn't over yet. As morning light revealed the aftermath of battle, Marcus Reynolds prepared for the next phase. He'd outfought their soldiers and outsmarted their mercenaries. Now, it was time to show Miguel Salazar why some old instructors never stopped teaching the deadliest lessons of all. The most important principle he'd ever taught his students was that the perfect shot wasn't just about aim or timing. It was about patience, about waiting for that one moment when everything aligned. And Marcus could sense that moment approaching, as inevitable as dawn. Miguel Salazar's response to defeat was swift and ruthless. Across Esperanza Valley, carefully planted explosives detonated in seemingly random locations. A gas station, a grain silo, the high school's empty gymnasium. No casualties, but the message was clear. He could still hurt the community. He's trying to divide our attention, Marcus observed, studying the pattern of explosions. Make us chase shadows while he slips away. Eleanor's voice crackled over the radio. Manuel just called. Salazar's compound in Nogales is burning. They're destroying evidence. Not just evidence, Sarah added. I'm getting reports of gunfire. He's eliminating witnesses. Marcus had seen this before. The desperate acts of a man whose carefully built empire was crumbling. But Salazar's violence had a purpose. Each explosion, each death was carefully calculated to cover his escape. "Multiple vehicles heading south," Jason reported from his observation post. "Looks like a convoy, but—" "Decoys," Marcus finished. "He's not with them." He turned to the map spread across the command center table. "Sarah, what do we know about his personal security?" 10 men, all ex-military. They've been with him for years. Sarah laid out photos. But here's the interesting part. None of them have been seen since yesterday. Marcus nodded. Professional bodyguards didn't vanish by accident. Eleanor, check the bank records. Look for any unusual patterns in the past 24 hours. Already on it. Eleanor's fingers flew across her keyboard. Large withdrawals from accounts in Mexico City and Monterrey, but there's something else. A series of small transactions at gas stations leading west. West? Jason's voice was skeptical. Towards California? That's exactly what we're meant to think. Which means he's going east, Marcus interrupted. Show me those gas station locations. The pattern emerged quickly, too obvious for a man like Salazar. He wants us looking west, Marcus said quietly, which means he's heading east, probably has a plane waiting at a private airstrip. Rosa burst into the command, sent her face flushed with urgency. My cousin just called. Salazar's bodyguards were seen at a ranch outside Tucson. They're setting up some kind of operation center. Not the bodyguards, Marcus corrected. Men dressed like them. Salazar's playing a shell game. Dr. Chen arrived with fresh coffee and his own intelligence. 3 of my patients work at the regional airport. They reported unusual maintenance activity on private planes last night. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities, discarding the obvious, looking for the subtle play. Salazar had spent years building his network through careful planning and misdirection. He wouldn't abandon those habits now. Eleanor, get me satellite coverage of every private airstrip within 200 miles. He turned to Sarah. How many of the captured mercenaries are talking? 6 so far. They're angry about being abandoned, want to make deals. Good. Show them photos of Salazar's known associates. See who they recognize from the planning sessions. The pieces started coming together, not the obvious pattern of a desperate escape, but the careful execution of a pre-planned contingency. Got something? Eleanor called. Small airstrip just inside Mexico, technically abandoned but showing recent activity. And look who owns the land through a shell company. Salazar's wife's cousin, Sarah finished. It fits his pattern. Family connections, one step removed. Marcus studied the satellite footage. The airstrip was perfect, remote enough to be private, close enough to reach quickly. But something wasn't right. Jason, take your team to the Tucson ranch. Don't engage, just observe. He turned to Sarah. Get me everything on Salazar's wife's family. Every property, every business connection. Rosa's phone buzzed. Another message from Manuel. One of Salazar's regular drivers just bought supplies. Enough for a long drive? Where? That's the strange part. Baby food, diapers. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Eleanor, pull up Salazar's family records. How many grandchildren does he have? The answer revealed the truth. Salazar wasn't running to a private plane or a secret compound. He was heading for the one place law enforcement wouldn't think to look, a young grandson's birthday party at a family ranch near Hermosillo. He's using innocence as cover, Marcus explained. Hiding behind family gatherings and children's parties. No one would look twice at guests arriving for a celebration. But knowing Salazar's destination wasn't enough. The cartel leader still had resources, loyal men, and a head start. Sarah, contact Mexican authorities. We need their cooperation. Marcus turned to Eleanor. Get me satellite coverage of every route from here to Hermosillo. He'll avoid main roads, but he can't go too far off-grid, not if he wants to maintain his innocent grandfather appearance. The hunt was on. Across the border, Salazar's diversions continued. Explosions, gunfights, multiple convoy sightings. But Marcus had spent decades learning to see through such smokescreens. All units, he broadcast, ignore the noise. Focus on these routes. He marked specific roads on the digital map. Look for vehicles that don't fit. Family cars driven. Too carefully. Local plates moving too purposefully. Hour by hour, the net tightened. Jason's team confirmed the Tucson ranch was a decoy. Eleanor's satellite analysis revealed suspicious traffic patterns. Sarah's contacts in Mexican law enforcement reported unusual activity around specific checkpoints. Then Manuel called with the final piece. One of Salazar's trusted cooks just bought a custom birthday cake. It was being delivered to a ranch outside Hermosillo tomorrow morning. Marcus smiled grimly. That's it. He's maintaining his cover story. To the end. He turned to his team. Contact Mexican authorities. Tell them we know about the birthday party, but stress this. There are children present. This has to be handled carefully. Eleanor looked up from her computer. Federal task. Force is ready. They're coordinating with Mexican special forces. Good. Marcus studied the map one final time. Because tomorrow morning, Miguel Salazar is going to learn that some parties have unexpected guests. As night fell over the border region, Marcus Reynolds prepared for the final phase of his operation. Salazar thought he was escaping to safety, using innocence as his shield. He was about to discover that even the best-planned escape routes could become traps when you were being hunted by a man who'd spent his life teaching others how to wait for the perfect moment. And tomorrow would bring that moment, when patience, precision, and justice would align in a way that would make this old instructor's final lesson unforgettable. Dawn broke over the ranch outside Hermosillo as party decorations fluttered in the morning breeze. Children's laughter echoed across the grounds while caterers prepared for the celebration. Miguel Salazar, dressed casually in expensive ranch wear, watched his grandson unwrap early presents. To anyone watching, it was a perfect family gathering. But Marcus Reynolds, observing through high-powered optics from 2 miles away, saw the truth beneath the facade. 6 security teams, he reported quietly, positioned to look like ranch hands, professional spacing, covering all approaches. Confirmed, Jason's voice crackled over the secure radio. These aren't regular bodyguards. They're his elite unit. Eleanor coordinated from their mobile command center. Mexican special forces are in position. They're waiting for your signal. Marcus studied the scene carefully. Salazar had chosen his ground well. Any direct assault would put innocent family members, especially children, at risk. The cartel leader was using his own grandchildren as human shields, counting on law enforcement's reluctance to endanger civilians. Rosa, Marcus called. Is Manuel's contact still in place? Yes, she's one of the catering staff. Says Salazar's keeping the children close, using family photos as cover. It was clever. Every time Salazar moved, he had a child in his arms or by his side. Even now, he sat with his grandson, playing the devoted grandfather, while his security teams maintained their watchful perimeter. But Marcus had seen this before in other conflicts, where civilians became tactical considerations. The solution wasn't force, it was patience. Sarah, signal the Mexican authorities. Tell them to proceed with Phase 1. Across the ranch, local police began setting up roadblocks. Nothing unusual, just routine checks for a high-profile family event. Salazar's security noticed, but the response was measured, professional. "They're good," Jason observed. "No obvious reactions." "They're supposed to be good," Marcus watched through his scope. "That's why we're not going to fight them." Eleanor's voice held a note of understanding. "We're going to let them surrender." Exactly. Marcus had spent decades learning that the best victories often came without firing a shot. Launch Phase 2. Across Mexico, coordinated raids hit Salazar's hidden assets. Bank accounts frozen, properties seized, safe houses surrounded. His entire financial empire began crumbling in real time. At the ranch, phones started buzzing. Security teams received urgent messages. The careful facade of a family gathering showed its first cracks. "He's realizing," Sarah reported, monitoring communications. "His backup plans are gone." Marcus watched Salazar's face through his scope. The cartel leader maintained his smile, bounced his grandson on his knee, but his eyes had changed. They were the eyes of a man watching his kingdom burn. "Now," Marcus ordered. Teresa's cousin's contact, the caterer, began serving breakfast. As plates circulated, children were gradually drawn away from the adults, attracted by specially prepared treats at a separate table. Natural, innocent, and completely deliberate. Salazar noticed, of course, but stopping it would mean breaking his grandfather facade. He could only watch as his human shields drifted away, drawn by the simple allure of sweets and games. "Children are clear," Eleanor confirmed. "Safe zone is secured." Marcus broadcast on an open frequency. "Miguel Salazar, this is Marcus Reynolds. Your security teams have already received the message. Every escape route is closed, every resource frozen. Your choice now is simple. Surrender peacefully or force us to end this violently." Salazar's response was immediate but measured. "You would attack a family gathering? Risk children's lives?" "The children are already safe," Marcus replied. "Check your security feeds. While you were playing grandfather, we were moving them to safety. Every child, every innocent family member." Through his scope, Marcus saw Salazar's mask crack. The cartel leader looked around, realizing that somehow, without violence or confrontation, his shield had evaporated. "Your security teams have a choice," Marcus continued. "They can die protecting a losing position, or they can surrender with honor, professional courtesy, one soldier to another." The response came from an unexpected quarter. Salazar's head of security stepped forward, his movement deliberate. "Stand down," he ordered his men. "The children are clear. We're not dying for a lost cause." One by one, weapons were laid down, professional soldiers choosing survival over pointless sacrifice. Salazar himself remained seated, his expensive clothes suddenly looking like a costume. "How?" he asked, as Mexican special forces moved in. "How did you dismantle everything so perfectly?" Marcus approached across the ranch yard, his steps unhurried. "Because you fought the way you always have, with money, violence, and intimidation. But I fought with something stronger." "And what's that?" "Community." Marcus watched as federal agents secured the scene. "Every person you threatened, every family you tried to bully, They became part of your defeat. The ranch hands who watched your movements, the cleaners who overheard your plans, the ordinary people you thought were beneath your notice. Eleanor's voice came over the radio. Federal task force confirms all objectives secured. Cartel leadership arrested across 3 states. In Esperanza Valley, Sarah coordinated the final phase, arresting corrupt officials, seizing documents, unraveling the entire network. The valley that Salazar had tried to conquer had become the anchor point of his destruction. Dr. Chen's voice added confirmation. All civilians accounted for and safe, no casualties. Marcus looked at the expensive decorations, the birthday presents, the carefully crafted illusion of family harmony. Your mistake wasn't underestimating me, Salazar. It was underestimating the strength of a community protecting its own. As the sun rose higher over the ranch, Marcus Reynolds watched federal agents lead Miguel Salazar away. The cartel leader had built his empire on fear and violence, never understanding that true strength came from unity, not force. Eleanor, he called, tell our people back home it's over. They can start rebuilding. Jason approached, his team securing the last of the weapons. Not how I expected this to end. No big shootout, no dramatic standoff. Marcus smiled slightly. Sometimes the best victories are the quiet ones. He looked across the ranch where children were being reunited with their families, families who never knew they'd been used as shields in a cartel leader's desperate gambit. Besides, he added, we're too old for dramatic shootouts. As Mexican authorities processed the scene, Marcus's phone buzzed with messages from Esperanza Valley, photos of people emerging from their homes, neighbors hugging, a community beginning to heal. The war was over, not with bullets and blood, but with patience, planning, and the unshakable strength of people standing together. Marcus Reynolds had taught his last lesson. Not about how to take a perfect shot, but about how to build something too strong to break. And that was a lesson worth waiting for. The return to Esperanza Valley felt different. Marcus watched. Through his truck's window as familiar landmarks passed by, the feed store, the old church, the high school gymnasium, places that had been battlegrounds just days ago, now returning to their peaceful purpose. 4 more arrests this morning, Sarah reported, driving beside him. State investigators found a paper trail linking Judge Harrison and 3 county commissioners to Salazar's operation. Marcus nodded. The cartel's influence had run deeper than anyone suspected, like roots of a poisonous plant. It had to be pulled out completely, or it would grow back stronger. Eleanor's voice came over the radio. Marcus, you need to see this. They found her at the ranch, surrounded by local families, the Andersons, the Millers, the Petersons, people who had lost homes, businesses, loved ones to the cartel's violence, but they weren't there to mourn. They're helping rebuild, Eleanor explained, watching volunteers repair bullet holes in the barn. Every family that can spare hands has shown up. Rosa emerged from the house carrying coffee for the workers, her children playing safely in the yard, no longer needing armed guards. The school board met this morning, she reported. They're replacing the principal and 4 administrators who were on Salazar's payroll. Dr. Chen arrived with his medical bag, checking on those who had been wounded in the fighting. But his real purpose was different, helping people process the trauma, rebuild their sense of safety. Community healing takes time, he reminded Marcus quietly. But it starts with days like this. Jason's team was packing up their equipment, preparing to move on to other assignments. But they worked slowly, helping repair damage where they could. "Never seen anything quite like this," Jason admitted, watching townspeople reclaim their community. "Usually, after an operation, we leave behind broken things. Here, everything's growing stronger." Sarah brought more news from town. The bank, a manager had confessed, revealing hidden accounts that had funded the cartel's operation, money that would now go to rebuilding the community. "States setting up a victims' compensation fund," she explained. "Every family that lost property, every business that was damaged, they'll be made whole." But the real victory wasn't in buildings repaired or money restored. Marcus saw it in the faces of his neighbors, the return of confidence, of dignity, of peace. Eleanor found him in his office, studying the old maps they'd used to plan the operation. "The federal task force finished their final sweep," she reported. "No more cartel assets in the valley. It's really over." Marcus nodded, but his mind was on the future. How many families lost their ranches, sold under pressure before we could stop it? 22. Eleanor understood where he was going. "The properties are being seized as criminal assets. They'll be auctioned. Make sure our people know when. These lands need to come home to the families that work them." Diego's husband Juan arrived with more volunteers, carrying lumber and tools. The ranch was becoming a gathering point, a symbol of resistance transformed into a center of recovery. "My cousin called from Nogales," Rosa said. "The Mexican authorities are dismantling Salazar's operation there too. People are finally speaking out, naming names." It was a cascade effect Marcus had seen before. Once fear's grip weakened, truth flowed like a flood. Every hour brought new revelations, new evidence of how deep the corruption had run. Dr. Chen treated minor injuries as people worked, but his real medicine was conversation. "They need to talk about it," he explained to Marcus. "Process what happened. Understand their own strength." Marcus watched children playing in the yard, not just Rosa's, but others from town. Their laughter was the sound of healing, of life returning to normal. Jason approached with his final report. "My team's moving out tomorrow, but I've been thinking, this model you've created, using community resistance against organized crime, it could work elsewhere." "It already is," Sarah added. "State police are studying what happened here, planning to implement similar strategies in other border communities." But Marcus knew the truth. It wasn't strategies or tactics that had won the day. It was people choosing to stand together, to resist fear, to protect their home. Eleanor organized meals for the workers. The ranch kitchen becoming a community center. Women shared recipes and stories. Children did homework at the big table. Men planned repairs and improvements. "You know what I realized," she said to Marcus that evening. "We're not just rebuilding what was here before. We're building something stronger." She was right. The cartel's violence had torn at the community's fabric. But like a broken bone, healing stronger at the break, Esperanza Valley was emerging more unified than ever. Sarah from the grocery store had reopened, her shelves stocked by donations. From neighboring towns, the high school football team practiced again, their field repaired by volunteer labor. The church bell rang on Sunday, calling people to prayer not in fear, but in gratitude. As night fell, Marcus stood on his porch, watching headlights move along familiar roads. Not cartel vehicles or surveillance teams now, just neighbors heading home after a day's work rebuilding their community. "You should be proud," Sarah said, joining him. "This is more than just defeating a cartel. This is showing people their own strength." Marcus nodded, understanding that the real victory wasn't in the battles won or enemies captured. It was in the resilience of ordinary people who had discovered their collective power. "Sarah says the Hendersons are planning to rebuild their barn," Rosa continued. "The whole town's turning out to help this weekend. That was the true defeat of men like Salazar, not in guns or raids or arrests, but in communities refusing to be broken, in people choosing hope over fear, unity over division." As stars appeared over Esperanza Valley, Marcus Reynolds watched his home heal. He'd spent his life teaching others how to shoot with deadly precision, but his greatest victory had come in showing people how to stand together. The war was over. Now the real work of peace could begin, built not on the skills of warfare, but on the strength of a community that had learned its own power. And that was a lesson worth teaching. "You know," Eleanor said softly, joining him on the porch, "when you were training snipers, you always said the perfect shot was about patience and precision." Marcus smiled. This was about patience too, waiting for people to discover their own strength. And in that discovery lay a victory more complete than any perfect shot could achieve. A community not just surviving, but thriving, growing stronger with each passing day. That was the final lesson Marcus Reynolds would teach. Not about taking life, but about building it, protecting it, making it flourish even in the face of those who would destroy it. And as the night deepened over Esperanza Valley, that lesson continued to spread, carried in the hearts of people who had learned that their greatest strength lay not in weapons or walls, but in the unbreakable bonds between neighbors who chose to stand together. 1 month after Miguel Salazar's arrest, Reynolds Ranch hosted a different kind of gathering. Picnic tables dotted the front yard, loaded with home-cooked food. Children played freely across the property that had once been under armed guard, the sound of laughter replacing the echo of gunfire. Marcus stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching his community celebrate not just victory, but renewal. The ranch had become a symbol of resistance. Now it was becoming a symbol of recovery. Final tally came in from the federal task force, Sarah reported, joining him with her own coffee. Now acting chief of police, she'd spent the past month rebuilding the department's integrity. 43 corrupt officials arrested across 4 states, Salazar's entire network exposed. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen where she'd been coordinating with other volunteers. "The Wilsons got their ranch back yesterday. That's the last of the seized properties returned to their rightful owners. The cartel's assets had been liquidated, the money flowing back into the community they'd tried to destroy. But the real wealth wasn't in bank accounts or property deeds. It was in the strengthened bonds between neighbors. Dr. Chen had converted his clinic's old storage room into a community center, providing a space for people to share their experiences, process their trauma, and help each other heal. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones you can't see, he'd explained to Marcus. But they heal faster when people heal together. Rosa and her family had moved back to their own home, no longer needing the safety of the ranch's guest house. But they still came by daily, part of the network of support that had emerged from the crisis. "My cousin called from Nogales," Rosa said, bringing Marcus a plate of food. "The changes are happening there too. People are standing up to cartels in other towns, using what they learned from us. Jason had returned for the celebration, bringing news from other border communities. They're implementing your model all along the frontier, he told Marcus. Community resistance coordinated with law enforcement. The cartels are finding their old tactics don't work anymore. Marcus watched children playing baseball in the front pasture, the same field where he'd once positioned defensive positions. Nature was already erasing those scars, new grass covering the old fighting holes. You know what I realized? Eleanor said softly, taking his hand. This is what you were really fighting for all those years, not just against something, but for this, peace, community, home. She was right. Marcus had spent his career training elite marksmen, teaching them to take the perfect shot. But his greatest victory had come in defending his own community, showing people their collective strength. Sarah brought more news as the afternoon progressed. The state legislature had passed new laws strengthening protection for border communities. Federal agencies were implementing new strategies based on Esperanza Valley's example. It's not just about fighting cartels anymore, she explained. It's about building communities too strong to be intimidated. Dr. Chen had set up his usual medical station, but today it was for checking blood pressure and giving flu shots, normal medical care for normal times. Children came by for candy and bandages for scraped knees, ordinary injuries from ordinary play. The nightmares are less frequent now, he told Marcus quietly. People are sleeping easier, healing. Juan coordinated with other ranchers, organizing shared labor for rebuilding projects. The skills they'd used to resist the cartel now served to strengthen their community's infrastructure. We're putting in new irrigation systems, he explained, showing Marcus the plans, connecting all the ranches, sharing resources, making everyone stronger together. The sun was setting when Jason pulled Marcus aside. Got word from federal prosecutors. Salazar's trying to make a deal, offering information on other cartels. Let him, Marcus replied. His time's past. The future belongs to people like this. He gestured to the gathering, families sharing food, children playing, neighbors helping neighbors. Eleanor joined them, bringing fresh coffee. Sarah, from the grocery store, says business is better than ever. People shopping locally, supporting each other's businesses. That was the real victory, Marcus noted. Not just defeating the cartel, but building something stronger in its place. As evening approached, someone started playing guitar. Music filled the air where gunfire had once echoed. Couples danced. On the grass, children chased fireflies, and the community that had stood together in war now celebrated together in peace. Sarah's radio crackled. A routine patrol report, nothing more. Normal police work in normal times. She smiled, remembering darker days when every call meant danger. You know what's remarkable? She said to Marcus. A month ago, we were fighting for survival. Now we're planning the fall harvest festival. Rosa's children played with others their age, no longer needing to look over their shoulders. Their laughter was the sound of healing, of fear replaced by joy. My cousin says other communities are asking how we did it, Rosa reported, how we stood up to the cartel and won. Tell them the truth, Marcus replied. We did it together. As stars appeared over Esperanza Valley, Marcus Reynolds watched his community celebrate their victory. But the real triumph wasn't in defeating an enemy. It was in rediscovering their collective strength, their shared purpose, their unbreakable spirit. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Ready to just be a rancher again? Marcus smiled, looking out. Over the gathering. The war was over, the healing well underway. His community had not just survived, but emerged stronger, more united, more resilient. "Yes," he said quietly, "it's time for peace." The night air filled with music, laughter, and hope. Esperanza Valley had faced its darkest hour and found its greatest strength, not in weapons or tactics, but in the unwavering bonds between neighbors who refused to be broken. This was his final lesson as an instructor. Not about taking the perfect shot, but about building something too perfect to need defending. And that lesson would live on, not in the memories of trained snipers, but in the daily lives of people who had learned to stand together against any threat. The future was bright, built on foundations stronger than fear, and Marcus Reynolds, watching his community celebrate, knew that some victories lasted far beyond the final battle. This was one of them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.